Imagine waking at 2 in the morning because your feet have gone numb. Not cold numb, the kind that makes you sit up in the dark and press your hands against your boots just to feel something. A dozen other men are breathing around you, packed shoulder to shoulder under damp canvas that smells of smoke, wet wool, and unwashed bodies. Somewhere near the middle of the tent, the little sheet iron stove has gone cold again, and nobody gets up to fix it. Nobody has the energy. Outside, the wind leans against the canvas like something trying to get in. This wasn't an unusual night. This was winter camp. The typical Sibley tents were built around a small sheet iron stove, its pipe running up through an opening at the peak of the canvas. About a dozen men slept in a circle around it, feet pointed toward the heat, heads toward the cold canvas wall. In theory, that was enough to keep everyone warm. In practice, it kept the worst of the cold from becoming unbearable, and not much more. On the coldest nights, the warmth melted frost that had formed on the inside of the tent, and hours later, once the fire died down, that same moisture dripped back onto blankets and sleeping men as ice. Keeping the stove going wasn't as simple as feeding it. Every log had to be found, cut, and dried, and during a long encampment, dry firewood became almost as valuable as food. Men rarely told anyone where they'd found a good supply. On many nights, the fire lasted only until midnight or so. Then someone would wake shivering, look over at a stove full of ash, and quietly weigh whether crawling out from under the blankets was worth the trouble. Some nights it was. More often, no one moved until dawn. The ground under the tents froze solid long before the coldest part of winter arrived. To keep from lying directly on it, soldiers spread what straw they could gather across the floor. Not a mattress, not really comfortable, just a thin barrier between a man's body and earth that seemed determined to pull the warmth out of him. Within a few weeks, the straw had flattened into something closer to dust, damp and dirty from constant use. And by midwinter, it offered almost no protection at all. Everyone worked out their own way of coping. Some curled tight beneath their blankets. Others pulled their overcoats over their legs or stuffed spare clothing under their shoulders for insulation. A man lucky enough to own a rubber blanket often laid it beneath himself to keep the ground's moisture from soaking upward. Mostly, though, men slept pressed, close together, because shared warmth mattered more than privacy ever could. Comfort had stopped being part of the conversation weeks earlier. You didn't really sleep in a winter camp. You rested just enough to get through to the next day. Wool was among the best materials a soldier could have, holding heat even when damp. But a winter camp had a way of defeating it anyway. Rain worked through the seams of the canvas, snow melted against the tent walls in the afternoon sun and refroze after dark, and boots tracked mud and slush in with every entrance. Before long, almost everything a man owned felt damp, and a dry blanket became something to be grateful for, rather than something to expect. A rubber blanket, if a soldier had one, was often spread beneath the wool to keep the cold ground from soaking through. Imperfect, but sometimes the difference between waking damp and waking soaked. Beyond that, men simply relied on each other. Sleeping shoulder to shoulder wasn't about friendship. More bodies meant more warmth. But staying warm was only half the fight. Finding enough to eat could be just as hard. Mornings usually began the same way. A square of hardtack, nothing more than flour, water, and salt baked nearly as hard as wood, dropped into a tin cup of hot coffee until it softened enough to bite without risking a tooth. Fresh bread rarely survived the supply lines, but hardtack could sit in a haversack for weeks through rain, heat, and rough wagon rides that would have ruined anything softer. Soldiers learned to break each cracker apart in the light first, knocking out the occasional weevil before eating. Nobody expected it to taste good. It filled a stomach and it kept almost indefinitely, which was the entire point. The coffee mattered more to most men. Hot, black, and strong enough that veterans later wrote about how the smell alone, drifting over the fires after a sleepless night, could lift a man's spirits before he'd even had a sip. Some mornings it was the only warm thing that touched him before noon. Salt pork arrived packed in barrels, cured heavily to survive the long trip to camp, and by the time it reached a soldier's plate, it was often greasy, oversalted, and occasionally starting to spoil. Cooking it usually meant slicing it thin, and frying it over whatever fire could be managed, often built from wood still green enough to smoke more than burn, stinging the eyes of anyone standing close. Nothing was wasted. The grease that rendered out flavored beans, soaked into bread, or got saved for the next meal. Good food was a luxury. Calories weren't optional. Rations weren't identical on both sides. As wheat grew scarcer in the South, Confederate soldiers leaned more heavily on cornmeal, mixed with little more than water and whatever salt could be spared, then poured into a skillet and set near the fire. The results depended entirely on the cook. Soft enough to tear apart some nights, burned black on the bottom and raw in the middle on others. Either way, it disappeared fast. Union camps saw more hardtack than cornbread, but in the Confederacy, cornmeal was often what there was. Nobody judged it by taste. If it filled the stomach, it had done its job. When dried beans were available, they went into a kettle with water and whatever scraps of salt pork could be spared, then simmered for hours by the fire, sometimes for most of a day, tended by whoever happened to walk past and stir it, without needing to be asked. The smell spread through camp long before the meal was ready, and for men who were cold and hungry, that alone made the wait a little easier. Served in dented tin cups, it wasn't elegant. It was hot, it was filling, and for a few quiet minutes it pushed the cold into the background. Fresh vegetables were rare in winter, so when a supply wagon actually delivered potatoes or onions, they were met with more enthusiasm than their humble reputation suggests. Not just for flavor, but because Army surgeons already understood, better than most soldiers did, how badly men living on salt meat and hard bread needed them. When fresh vegetables weren't available, the Army tried a substitute. Blocks of dried, pressed cabbage, carrots, onions, and turnips meant to be dropped into boiling water. The idea made more sense on paper than in a mess kit. The result was a grayish stew that soldiers gave unflattering nicknames and joked tasted worse than the scurvy it was meant to prevent. Still, surgeons kept pushing it and soldiers kept eating it, because staying in the ranks mattered more than enjoying the meal. In the hardest stretches of winter, official rations simply didn't arrive, delayed by snow, washed-out roads, or exhausted draft animals, and soldiers looked elsewhere. An abandoned apple orchard, turnips left behind after harvest, a chicken that wandered too close to camp. Sometimes it was traded for, sometimes it was quietly taken, and most men understood the line between military regulation and an empty stomach well enough to stop worrying about which side of it they were on. None of it shows up in the official ration records, but it happened often enough that veterans rarely thought it worth mentioning. Cold wasn't the only threat in a winter camp. Weeks of damp clothing, crowded tents, and poor sanitation let illness move through the ranks nearly as fast as the weather did, and diseases like pneumonia, dysentery, and influenza killed more soldiers over the course of the war than bullets ever did. The cold rarely finished a man off directly. More often, it simply wore his body down until something else could. A hot meal, a dry pair of socks, one more log on the fire. None of it guaranteed survival, but it improved the odds, and a little was often all there was to work with. By February, most soldiers had stopped talking about the cold the way they had in November. There was nothing new left to say about it. The stove still struggled to last until morning, the straw was still thin, the blankets were rarely fully dry, and the coffee was still bitter. And yet every sunrise meant they'd made it through another night. Somewhere in that repetition, something shifted. Not the weather and not the tents, the men. What had felt unbearable in the first weeks of winter became slowly just familiar. Not because it got easier, but because enduring it had become part of daily life. Winter camp was never remembered for dramatic moments. It was remembered for the sameness of it, the same frozen ground, the same smoky fires, the same simple meals, the same faces gathered around a stove that never quite kept up with the cold. For many Civil War soldiers, that quiet endurance was the real test of the war. Long before the smoke of battle ever reached them, they had already learned what it meant just to survive the night and then to do it again.